Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, and Kata, thank you very much for the kind introduction. About 200 kilometers north of Luxor, on the eastern bank of the Nile, lies Akhmîm, Egypt's oldest city, as the geographer Leo Africanus called it in the 15th century. Actually, it has a continuous history that stretches over a period of now 6,000 years until today. Strabon in the 1st century BC described the city as an ancient dwelling place of the linen weavers. Indeed, from pharaonic times to the present, the region around Akhmîm is considered the most important center of textile production in Egypt. In the next 40 minutes, I would like to take you on a virtual journey to this extraordinary place, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to do this. Archaeological textiles may not be as familiar to you as other products of the material culture of everyday life in antiquity, such as ceramics, glassware, metalwork, or bone carvings. This is mainly due to the fact that textiles are much less frequently attested at excavation sites than other types of material. In our regions, if at all, they have often only left traces as imprints on objects made of metal or clay. In Egypt, the situation is different. Thanks to perfect climatic conditions and local burial sites, thousands and thousands of textiles have survived as in no other country of the ancient world. For Akhmîm, they are of particular importance because they can be found in almost all epochs over a period of several millennia. Before we turn to the material itself, I would like to give you a brief overview of the discovery and exploration of the cemeteries of Akhmîm, from which vast quantities of textiles were recovered, especially in the 1880s and 1890s. They bear witness to a lively local production. The present site of Akhmîm is situated above the ruins of the ancient city Ipu. In ancient Egypt, this was the capital of the 9th Upper Egyptian district, where particularly the fertility deity Min was worshipped. His name is still included in the later Coptic name of the place, which is Shmin. The Greeks equated Min with the shepherd god Pan, from which, in turn, Panopolis, the Greek name of the place, is derived. In Greco-Roman times, the city had the largest temples in the country. Their ruins were still called wonders of the world by the Arab writers of the Middle Ages. Today, they have almost disappeared. In early Christian times, Panopolis was the capital of the province of Thebais and the seat of a bishop. There were several Coptic monasteries in the area. Some still exist today, like the monasteries of Pshoi and the famous Abbot Shinuti, better known by their popular names, the Red and White Monasteries, on the opposite western side of the Nile near Sohag. In the 4th and 5th centuries, Shinute, the most controversial personality of early Christian monasticism in Egypt, lived there. The alchemist Zosimus and the poet Nonnes of Panopolis, a contemporary of Shinuti, also belongs to the intellectual grades of the town, whose works were known far beyond the regional borders. To Nonnes, we owe the last epic of antiquity, the Dionysiaca, which describes the triumphant march of Dionysus to India. His work is of particular importance because it reflects the cultural change in the society of the time at the transition from polytheistic antiquity to monotheistic Christianity. The diverse pictorial motifs and themes from that period particularly survived on textiles. Traces of a silk fabric with scenes from the life of Mary, for instance, were clumped together with a piece of the famous Dionysus hanging in the Abeck-Stiftung in Rigisberg, Switzerland, before restoration. This means that they must have come from the same grave. Other examples are two tunic fragments showing dances from the retinue of Dionysos, which are combined with the Christian symbol of the cross. The jeweled crosses are colored, all other motifs are rendered in the typical light-dark style of late antiquity. In that period, the city and the surroundings of Akhmîm were characterized by the counter-existence and coexistence of competing religious cultures. With the Arab conquest, Islam is added as a further element in the 7th century. These epochs are particularly relevant for the local textile history of the Panopolitan region and are therefore in the focus of today's lecture. The town of Akhmîm was continuously built over from antiquity to the present day. Older buildings were used to procure materials for the new ones to be built by the following generations, which explains why ancient building structures hardly exist anymore. It also means that archaeological remains of workshops related to textile production can no longer be traced. But on the western side of the Nile, in the Ptolemaic temple complex of Atripe, where colleagues from Tübingen have been excavating for years, a dyer's workshop was uncovered. It belonged to a nunnery that was established in the temple complex in Christian times and is still an indication of regional textile production apart from the products themselves. The sparse remains of ancient Akhmîm were already noticed by European travelers of the 18th century. It was once one of the most important cities in Egypt from the pre-dynastic period to the times of the Mamelukes in the 15th century. Extensive necropolises belong to it, located to the east of the city. The tombs with their diverse grave goods testify to the continuous settlement of Akhmîm and its surroundings. Textiles from the Old Kingdom, for instance, were found in the 1980s in the rock tombs of El Hawarish during excavations by Macquarie University in Sydney. Among them, a considerable number of pleated linen dresses, which seem to be typical for the region in the Old Kingdom and First Intermediate period. The first excavations in the three main cemeteries, marked A, B, and C on the plan by Kuhlmann, took place between 1884 and 1888 under the French Egyptologist Gaston Maspereau. As exciting and new as the finds from the tombs were for the scholars and researchers at that time, their discovery was at the same time disastrous because they also attracted grave robbers and dealers who plundered and devastated the ancient burial sites. In his 1983 book on the materials on the archaeology and history of Akhmîm, Klaus-Peter Kuhlmann summarizes the catastrophic conditions there as the saddest chapters in the history of archaeological discoveries in Egypt, because almost all basics for scientific investigations on the history of an Egyptian city have been destroyed. Despite the irretrievably lost archaeological context, the necropolises of Akhmîm-Panopolis are considered the main sites of textiles and other objects of everyday culture from antiquity. In the 1880s, only one other site was known to yield archaeological textiles in larger quantities in the country, namely Madinat al-Fayoum, the ancient Asinoi or Crocodilopolis and capital of the Fayoum oasis. Another well-known excavation site, Antinopolis in Middle Egypt, was only explored later from 1896 onwards. Therefore, there is no doubt that the vast majority of textile finds that came into circulation in the mid-1880s were either from Akhmîm or from the Fayoum. However, the actual origin must be verified in each individual case. The necropolis from which Maspereau's excavation team recovered mainly objects from late antiquity and the first centuries of Arab rule was located in the area between Dar al-Wastani and Dar al-Qibli, northeast of the city, on the eastern side of a canal marked on Kuhlmann's map as Cemetery A. Kuhlmann describes the cemetery as an absolutely bare hill consisting of gravel and sandbags about 20 to 30 meters high and about 3 kilometers long, sloping steeply to the west towards the edge of the fertile land and running out flatly to the east into the Wadi basin. There were no rock tombs here, but pit tombs. It is highly probable that most of the textiles from Akhmîm that are now in European and North American collections came from this area. Textiles from the Pharaonic and Greco-Roman periods came to light mainly in the northern cemetery, C at Al-Salamuni. The three-part cartonnage of the mummy of a woman, now in the Georg Steindorf Museum in Leipzig, is one of the few objects from the Greco-Roman period that has been examined in detail to date. It was formed from various linen fabrics, then plastered, painted, and decorated with incised gold leaf. Maspero's finds also prompted his contemporary colleagues to visit Akhmîm to conduct research and not least to acquire objects that were then sold on or given away. One of them was the Italian Egyptologist Ernesto Schiaparelli, who worked together with Maspero in Akhmîm. He mainly studied the inscriptions of the Old Kingdom tombs in Cemetery B, but numerous specimens in the Turin Egyptian Museum prove that he also collected textiles. They match pieces attributed to Akhmîm in other collections. On the slide, only one example of many. Visitors in the late 19th century included the Viennese carpet dealer Theodor Graf, whose acquisition came to Vienna and other European collections. The Russian researcher Vladimir de Bock, to whom the late antique Egyptian antiquities in the Hermitage essentially go back, and the German Coptologist Karl Schmidt, who mainly supplied the Berlin museums with objects from Egypt. The Akhmîm burial grounds also seem to have been the main source for the extensive textile collection of the Aachen canon and textile historian Franz Bock, although concrete proof of this has yet to be provided. Robert Forrer, a Swiss archaeologist and art collector who carried out excavations in Akhmîm a few years later, commented that Bock himself had never been there. Although Forrer complained in his publications about the superficial find reports, and he strongly advocated not taking finds out of context, he himself drew abundantly from the art trade before he began his own excavations in Akhmîm in 1894. After all, he already owned a collection of about 2,000 pieces, which an agent purchased for him in Akhmîm from the finders. Although it is highly probable that the textiles in Forrer's early collection actually came from Akhmîm, one should only trust the information provided by the dealers with caution. Objects from the newly discovered site of Akhmîm were desired at the time, and the origin Akhmîm was therefore a kind of quality mark that promoted sales. We therefore cannot exclude that finds of different provenance were mixed in the antiquities stores. Sometimes the name Akhmîm is found embroidered or written in ink on one or the other piece itself, faintly visible on the left edge of the sleeve fragment from the Museum of Byzantine Art in Berlin. Since we do not know who inscribed these textiles, this information is also not 100% reliable. The origin of Forrer's early collection is therefore just as questionable as that of the textiles gathered by his contemporaries. Nevertheless, it formed the basis for his studies on the Akhmîm site, published in the early 1890s. Akhmîm, however, is only secured as a place of origin for the textiles that Forrer brought back from his own excavation and that subsequently circulated. The letters he wrote during his stay in Egypt to his friend Gustav Müller are still the most reliable and critical source on his finds. These refer to the places where Forrer dug. Several cemeteries are mentioned by name, including Al-Hawawish, which is Cemetery A, which is probably the most productive in terms of late antiquity and early Islamic period finds. Farah explicitly speaks of graves from the Byzantine period around the Al-Kipli monastery, from which high-quality silk weavings came and where, in his opinion, priests were buried. Farah's letters do, however, contain some valuable information on the layout and furnishings of the tombs and also on individual finds. Although it is not possible to link his descriptions to a specific object, they at least allow a comparison with similar pieces from the abundance of material attributed to Akhmîm. Farah describes both rectangular tombs made of bricks and simple pits. Some graves were covered with plain, undecorated slabs. Elsewhere, however, Farah also mentions decorated grave stelae. A temporal attribution of the different types cannot be deduced from his notes, however. Some of the tombs of the nobility were built up with mud bricks, as Kuhlmann's reconstruction shows. The size of the grave depends on the body size of the individuals, but also on their social position. They are almost exclusively oriented from west to east. In one of the letters to Müller, Farah describes two mummies in more detail. Quote, "The newly discovered mummy immediately indicated that a grand seigneur was present here. The more it was freed from sand and stones, the broader it appeared and the more the large ornamental circle with which the mantle around the mummy was decorated came to light." The depiction of the circle in Farah's publication corresponds exactly to the circle at the top right on a large cover in the Museum of Byzantine Art. It gives a good impression of the fabric that Farah found in said tomb. It could even be the piece itself. Farah writes further, "The contrast between rich and poor is strikingly sharp in these mummies. The rich man enters the tomb ostentatiously with an infinite number of layers of bandages, which make him appear broad, thick, and long. This ballast and his backboard make the rich man's mummy heavy, while the outer covers show his high rank by colored decoration. The poor man is different. The mummy looks slender. As the backboard is missing, it bends and is light, all the more because the bandages and layers of cloth are few. Almost no ornaments are seen, and the body of the dead man betrayed far less care in the mummification." End quote. The material that came into the museums and collections in such large numbers was usually decorated textiles, and in Farah's estimations, from the graves of the middle and upper classes. The second corpse Farah describes was wrapped in several cloths, padded with rags and worn clothing in such a way that the head and shoulder area was graduated. Farah also recorded, under this wrapping, a large cloth now appeared, a cloak with blue clavi and stars woven in as a central decoration. Wrapped in this cloth, the deceased had been placed on a board corresponding to his body length. Such a board and fragments of comparable mantles from Farah's former possession are now in the Museum of Byzantine Art. It is most likely that Farah described two tombs from the 3rd to 4th century. Interesting is the remark that the deceased were naked under the stuffed layer of cloth. Elsewhere, in connection with an Arab tomb, he mentioned that he was surprised by the fact that the deceased was dressed in trousers, tunic, and cap, whereas this is not the case in what he called Coptic burials. There, discarded garments served at best as filling material. These are mostly badly worn, while other garments from Akhmîm have been preserved quite well. It seems that burial customs changed over the centuries. From the mummy bundles, which were still in the Roman tradition, there was apparently a gradual shift to burying the deceased dressed. In his travel letters, Farah described one Christian and two Muslim cemeteries near the city of Akhmîm with abundant finds. Several times he mentioned Arab garments and fabrics with Kufic inscriptions. The finds prove a settlement far into the Arab period. At an unspecified time, these necropolises were abandoned. The city lost importance, but has preserved its tradition as a center of textile production to this day. Since the 1960s, various non-governmental organizations have initiated social projects to revive the craft that has been handed down for millennia. The Akhmîm Community Center produces, among other things, fabrics and embroideries that draw on motifs from late antique textile art and reinterpret them. But back to the originals. Opinions on the dating of the textile finds from the post-pharaonic tombs are controversial. Masperoux attributes them to the 7th to 10th centuries. Forrer, on the other hand, states that the Coptic occupation began in the course of the first 2 centuries already and continued through the Roman and Byzantine periods until the time of the Arab conquest of Egypt. According to the Baedeker from 1927, the graves date to the from the 5th to the 15th century. Textiles with plain purple stripes in a dark purple color can certainly be attributed to the Roman period. Those with ornamental design characterized by fine drawing with light linen threads on a purple ground are typical of the late 3rd to early 5th century. From the 4th century onwards, colored elements are gradually added, at first still very sparsely, used for small details. Parallel to this, there is a group of multicolored tapestries in a naturalistic style with fine transition of colors. In fabrics characterized as Byzantine, color became dominant, while the drawing of the motifs was getting more and more abstract. The figures are often difficult to determine, and the drawing is often misunderstood and copied quite mechanically from older models. In contrast, the colors are often as fresh as if they had only recently escaped the dye bath, Forrer writes. And further, we encounter numerous holy figures, even biblical scenes and inscriptions in Coptic script and language with biblical texts. In addition, plant motifs and ornaments of Oriental influence as well as Arabic characters are mixed in, so that in the finds from Akhmîm, it is hardly possible to distinguish where Byzantine art ends and Arabic art begins. These textiles are now attributed to the 7th to 10th centuries, the period when Egypt was already under Muslim rule. Pattern silk and printed cottons also appear during this epoch. Forrer mentions 2 linen fabrics with Kufic inscriptions embroidered in silk, each containing a date 287 and 289 of the Hijra, corresponding to the years 900 and 902 of our calendar. I have not yet been able to identify the originals. Possibly they are among the drawings illustrated on a plate in his publication on silk fabrics from Akhmîm. After Forrer, the Akhmîm excavation site was ignored for decades until renewed interest in the study of the cemeteries began in the 1970s. In 1977, the German Archaeological Institute in Cairo resumed work on the rock temple from the time of Egypt, located in the cemetery C near Al-Salamuni, and began the cartographic recording of the antiquities of the entire era. 2 years later, an Australian team from the Macquarie University, led by Naguib Kanawati, began investigating the rock tombs of Cemetery B, which largely date from the Old Kingdom. And at the same time, a team from the University of Minnesota, led by Sheila McNally, was devoted to the urban area of Akhmîm with the aim of exploring the late antique and early Christian layers. Between 2012 and 18, the late antique material culture of the Akhmîm area has been the subject of an interdisciplinary research project at the University of Göttingen under the direction of Rafet El-Sayed. In cooperation with museums worldwide, the members of the Akhmîm-Panos project tried to document objects of all material genres from the Akhmîm region. The original aim was to record these objects in an online database and make them accessible for research. Unfortunately, however, this database has not yet been activated. Nevertheless, the Akhmîm-Panos project was the trigger for restorative and scientific processing of the textiles attributed to Akhmîm-Panopolis in the Museum of Byzantine Art. My colleague Katrin Melk, textile conservator, and I work on this continuously. The first results were presented in an exhibition about Akhmîm, the Forgotten City, which took place last year in the James Simon Gallery of the Staatliche Museen in cooperation with the Egyptian Museum in Berlin and the Akhmîm-Panos colleagues in Göttingen. In the medium term, the plan is to also make the textile holdings of other museums and collections accessible. To push this forward, a conference was held in Göttingen in autumn 2017 with the aim of establishing a loose interdisciplinary textile research network. A group of scholars from international institutions and collections came together who have set themselves the goal of researching the textiles attributed to Akhmîm area with a holistic approach. The papers held during the event were published in the series Studia Panopolitana in 2020. As a result, individual research projects developed at the University of Lublin with the aim of exploring the Akhmîm textiles in Polish collections. Another project was established in 2021 at the Center for Textile Research at the University of Copenhagen in connection with the National Museum of Denmark, and a further research project at the Art and History Museum in Brussels, which is dedicated to the silk weavings of the town. In the following part, I would like to introduce selected examples from the rich fund of the Akhmîm cemeteries in more detail. Even if the actual origin of the textiles attributed to Akhmîm has to be questioned in each individual case, there are a few exceptions that led directly to the site. Very rarely do the textiles themselves give an indication of their place of production. All the more valuable in this context is a carpet fragment with an Arabic inscription, which is now kept in the Textile Museum in Washington. The inscription not only states that the carpet was made in Akhmîm, but also offers a date, the year 203 of the Hijra, which corresponds to the year 818-19 of our era. This original fragment supports the statement of the Arab geographer Yaqubi that Akhmîm was known at that time for the production of carpets with cut pile. The tapestry now in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London with the personification of a city goddess also refers to Akhmîm. Above her head, which is covered with a mural crown, the Greek letters Panos can be read. This is an abbreviated form of the city name Panopolis, common in late antiquity. The textiles attributed to Akhmîm are now scattered among many museums, especially in Europe and North America. In the acquisition books of the Museum for Byzantine Art, for instance, about 130 textiles are marked with Akhmîm as place of origin. Most of them come from the former Farah collection. Others were purchased by Josef Strigowski, and isolated pieces were acquired or donated by Franz Bock, Karl Maria Kaufmann, and Karl Reinert, a former consul in Egypt. About another 100 fabrics from the Berlin collection can be assigned to Akhmîm with great probability on the basis of analogies. As mentioned, Robert Forrer's publications, but also Maurice Gersbach's richly illustrated volume, Les Tapisseries Coptes, from 1819, are decisive for the attribution to the find spot Akhmîm. In his introduction, Gersbach mentions that most of the textiles he illustrates can be traced back to Maspero's excavations in Akhmîm. If one compares the textiles depicted in the publications from the late 19th century with those gathered by various collectors with the supposed Akhmîm origin with each other, a certain conformity can be established in many cases, which speaks for one and the same place of discovery. From the abundance of material, special groups with particular stylistic and technical features or with characteristic patterns and motifs can be identified, which most probably go back to the textile workshops in Akhmîm, even if the proof still has to be provided by a systematic evaluation. These include a group of cushion or blankets with a long pile on the surface and relatively large interwoven squares. The squares are all decorated according to the same principle. A circular or wavy band inhabited with arrows, various animals, leaves and flowers or fruit baskets runs around a central circle with dominant figural motifs. Individual motifs in the axis are often accentuated by multicolored elements that contrast charmingly with the otherwise monochrome representations in dark red. A radiocarbon analysis was recently carried out on some examples to determine their age. It resulted in a dating range of about 340 to 580 AD. Another group characteristic of the region around Akhmîm consists of silk weavings with depictions of fighting or hunting horsemen, human figures, mythical creatures, animals, palmets, and other plant motifs. Sometimes these are accompanied by the names Zacharias and Joseph, written in Greek, which are probably the names of local workshops or weavers. An unusual silk tunic in the Museum of Byzantine Art also belongs to this group. When Joseph Strykowski acquired it from the antique dealer Daniel Fouquet in Cairo in the winter of 1900, he was already lamenting the modern arrangement of the individual fragments into an apparently intact half. You can see this condition on the slide on the left. My colleague Katrin Melk has unraveled all the pieces and has rearranged them as far as possible according to their original position. The original set of trimmings is almost completely preserved, and their decoration is coordinated. The clavi are divided into rectangular segments in which nereids, busts of city personifications, and hunting youths are depicted between plant motifs. Busts of Taikis also decorate the center of the round trimmings. All the trimmings are framed by a three-striped band with multicolored chevron and pearl bar on the outside and rolled heart-shaped leaves in the central strip. Both the trimmings and the plain base fabric have been woven in a special technique called samite. This old tunic seemed to be without parallel so far. A complete set of silk trimmings is preserved on a tunic in London's Victoria and Albert Museum, but its basic fabric is linen and not silk. 14C analysis of the ground fabric and the trimmings of the Berlin tunic yielded a dating period between 774 and 941 with a 95% probability. This corresponds exactly to the dates for a series of so-called Akhmîm silks with naturally and stylized palmettes. Always associated with Akhmîm is also a series of the 7th to 10th century tapestries with scenes or individual motifs from classical mythology or the Bible. They appear on an intense red background and are surrounded by a triple border zone, as we have just seen in the trimmings of the silk tunic. The figures in these tapestries are characterized by dissolved comic-like body shapes and faces with oversized eyes, colorful clothing, and thick black contour lines. An important representative of this group are the so-called Joseph tapestries, of which more than 100 examples are known in the meantime. With a few exceptions, they depict the first part of the story of the Old Testament patriarch Joseph according to Genesis, either as a cycle or in individual episodes. The tapestry you see on the slide once belonged to a tunic. On a rich red ground, 9 scenes from the story of Joseph are reproduced clockwise or anti-clockwise. The story begins in the central medallion, where the dreaming Joseph is depicted. Further episodes from the stories are told around this central medallion, here in an anti-clockwise direction, beginning with Joseph's father Jacob above the dreaming scene. The textiles shown so far represent the everyday culture of the citizens of Akhmîm. Apart from these, there's a little number of liturgical costume elements that probably, if Farrar was correct in his assumption, came from the Byzantine priestly tombs at Deir al-Qibli. These include an omophorion, a maniple, and individual fragments of silk embroidery from the previous possession of Robert Farrar. The omophorion, now preserved in 3 parts, is a scarf-like band which, as the name suggests, was worn around the shoulders. It was, like the maniple, one of the insignia of a bishop. The narrow linen band is adorned with alternating silk trimmings of various shapes and rectangular pictures depicting scenes from the life of Jesus. Based on technological details and a radiocarbon analysis, the omophorion can be dated to the period between 819 and 1016. Ritual clothing from early Christian times is also attested for monasticism in the Akhmîm region. Originals, however, have not been proven so far, except for one accessory in the Museum of Byzantine Art. Instead, there are a number of representations of monks in exactly the habit as described by Pacome, the founder of Egyptian monasticism, in his rules from the first half of the 4th century. Rule 81 lists the following garments for a monk: 2 linen tunics, a long scarf for the neck and shoulders, a goatskin hanging from the shoulder, shoes, 2 hoods, a belt, and a staff. The abbot Chinute mentioned at the beginning is depicted exactly in this costume in a relief in the Museum of Byzantine Art and in wall paintings of the Red Monastery in Sohag. Chinute wears a belted tunic. His hood is not pulled over his head but rests on his shoulders and is held together at the front with a knotted band. The scarf or twisted cloth lies over his left shoulder, and he holds the staff with his right hand. The goatskin runs from one shoulder across the torso, hangs down on the other side of the body, and ends in 3 tails. An original of such a goatskin is depicted on one of the plates from Oscar Wolff's Berlin Catalogue Raisonné with the number 700. Unfortunately, it belongs to the losses of the Second World War. The depictions of the monks in the wall paintings of the Sohag monasteries founded by Chinute testify that they followed the Pacomian dress code. Finally, let us have a look back to the period around 1900, when late antique textiles from Egyptian soil came to light in large quantities. With their rediscovery, trade also flourished, as we have seen. The colorful textiles, which were still unknown at that time, aroused astonishing interest among museums and private collectors. The varied patterns and motifs on the textile pictures met with enthusiastic approval. In order to meet demand and sell the finds as profitably as possible, it was common practice to cut the decorated sections out of the fabrics and sell them individually, which is why almost completely preserved textiles like the two tunics on the slide are relatively rare. The tapestry fragments were not only pretty to look at, but also affordable and easy to transport, which contributed to their rapid worldwide distribution. The first exhibitions and sales shows were organized in Europe shortly after the discovery, first by Theodor Graf in cooperation with the Orientalist and pioneer in study of late antique textiles from Egypt, Josef Karabacek, but also by Franz Bock and a few years later by Albert Gaillet, the excavator of Antinopolis. Apart from that, almost every researcher, art dealer, diplomat, doctor, or engineer working in Egypt at the time built up his or her own collections from the proceeds of the excavations or purchases from the antiquities trade, parts of which were in turn exchanged among themselves or sold on. This explains why fragments that originally belonged together are now distributed among different collections. But it was above all the arts and crafts associations and museums that emerged in Europe and North America in the course of the industrialization in the second half of the 19th century that sought textile samples from all periods of history and from all over the world as illustrative and teaching material for manufacturers, craftsmen, and interested laypeople. The finds from antiquity were ideally suited for this purpose. Their patterns were used as models for the now mechanized textile and wallpaper production. But also artists, writers, theater props makers, and couturiers were also inspired by the rediscovered evidence from the past. Many of them, including Auguste Rodin and Henri Matisse, had small collections of their own, most of which were arranged through the art dealer Dirkan Kelekian. His passion for ancient textiles was captured in a portrait of Kelekian by the American artist Milton Avery. Avery painted the antiquities dealer in front of a wallpaper with motifs borrowed from late antique Egyptian textile art. Henri Matisse used the bizarre forms as a model for his gouache, and the peculiar style of the figures on the late antique tapestries probably also influenced the work of Pablo Picasso. In Berlin, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner and the costume researcher and painter Max Thielke artistically explored the late antique textiles in the Egyptian Museum and in what was then the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, now the Bode Museum. Kirchner's diaries contain several pages of sketches of individual motifs of textiles from Akhmîm. Max Thielke, on the other hand, worked intensively on the garments from the collection of the Museum of Byzantine Art. He studied the originals on site and made drawings that resulted in watercolors, often in several versions. They were incorporated into his costume works, which remain a standard work for textile research to this day. Contemporary fashion also revisits late antique clothing from time to time. Clémentine Hélène Dufault, an expressionist painter, even portraited herself in a robe in the style of a late antique tunic. It was probably designed by Mariano Fortuny. Fortuny, a Spanish fashion designer who worked mainly in Venice, deliberately drew on the clothing of antiquity in his collections from around 1910. Among other things, he created formal dresses in the style of late antique tunics. One of these gowns, which takes up the decorative principle of late antiquity in a particularly beautiful way, can be found in the estate of the actress Eleonora Duse in Venice. The richness of color and the variety of motifs and abstract forms, but also the imperfection of the fragments from late antiquity and the first Muslim centuries, seem to appeal equally contemporary artists. Juliane Leitsch, who lives in northern Germany, is fascinated above all by what is missing or worn out, as well as by restoration processes, which she realizes artistically mainly using a small collection of textiles from Robert Forrest's property in Magdeburg. A similar approach is taken by Gail Rothschild, a Brooklyn-based artist who became aware of late antique tapestry fabrics in connection with her series Portraits of Ancient Linen. Since then, she has been using them in a monumental way in her paintings. The Godwin Turnbuck Museum of Queens College in New York showed her works for the first time at the end of 2018. In 2019, Gail Rothschild visited us in Berlin and spontaneously caught fire for some of the textiles in our collection coming from Akhmîm. The idea of an exhibition was born, which, if nothing unexpected will happen, will be open on 1st July this year in the Bode Museum, and to which you are warmly invited. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you for your really rich and fascinating presentation, Cecilia. This was really a joy to watch. Oh. And also for giving us a glimpse into the directions of research into the Akhmîmic textile, and also how they influence artists, modern artists and contemporary artists as well. So I am sure there will be some questions, and I am turning first to the audience. Yes, here is someone already. Elder Wright, is there much evidence for wool textiles in Akhmîm and Sohag during the Ptolemaic period?
Sorry, I didn't. Did I understand it right? The evidence of woolen?
For woolen textiles in Akhmîm and Sohag during the Ptolemaic period.
Not for the Ptolemaic period. Wool textiles, we have no proof before the Roman period up to now. I cannot say it with certainty. Maybe there is something among the objects which are not studied yet, but as far as I know and what I've seen, all the textiles from the Ptolemaic period seem to be made of linen only.
Thank you.
Does this answer your question?
Now it is okay to unmute yourself if you would like to comment. The next question comes from, yeah, I think the answer is yes. Next question comes from Arpad. I'm wondering if we know of any fake Coptic textiles. Is there any evidence of forgery production?
Not really fakes, but pasticcios made of various fragments and put together to really curious new forms. Some of them are published in the catalogue of the Textile Museum in Cairo, and in the text also in a book about the textile collection in Antwerp. I can show it to you, Arpad, on the next occasion. They really look strange. I think making forgeries or it's not lucrative because it's very intensive and long-term work to create such a tapestry textiles. So if you make a forgery, and they are, at least nowadays, the textiles in the art market are not that expensive if you only want to have a fragment. So I think it's too much effort to make a forgery. It's not necessary because we have so much material.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Yes, Claire. Can you go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for a fascinating talk. My question is to do with the Roman period. Clement of Alexandria, who died in around 215 AD, says that Christians shouldn't wear dyed coloured clothes or clothes with patterns on them. And that suggests to me that those things were available in Alexandria when he lived. And I wondered whether you had any evidence of coloured clothing from that period, or is it all later?
Yes, this is, they belong to the Roman period, and in this time usually the decoration of the garments was still scarce. We have these dark colored stripes, only mostly not decorated anymore, except the color itself. Maybe sometimes roundels and sometimes fine decoration made with linen thread. This is typical for this period. But as Clement from Alexandria says in his writings that people wear colored or decorated clothing, it means that it must have existed in that time, and that's true. We have no evidence from Alexandria because of the climatic conditions there, but from other sites they are existent.
Thank you.
Any more questions or comments? Maybe while you are still thinking, I have one. This might be, I don't know if there is a definitive answer because of the climatic conditions, but is there any way to know how far textiles from Akhmîmic workshops traveled within Egypt and maybe outside of Egypt? Do we have any information on this trade?
As far as I know, I must say up to now, I didn't come along such an evidence. I know that there was an exchange with papyri, with manuscripts. Why not with textiles? Because Akhmîm was a famous productive city in the period from late antiquity to the early Arab period. I can imagine that there was a trade, but it's hard to prove.
Yeah,
the evidence we have now.
Thank you.
And there's not much written documents from that period that survives from Akhmîm. So as from Oxyrhynchos, for example, where we have more written evidence.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, but maybe we have textual evidence and not the pieces themselves, but okay, thank you. Is there anyone else with questions or comments? Yes, a question from Rana. Are there any textiles with planets or other astrological symbolism?
No, as far as I know, not. No, I didn't come along.
Okay, last chance to ask questions. Okay, if not, then I would like to thank you again, Cäcilia, for this talk.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you. And we will meet again for our next lecture in a month's time. So thank you all for coming and have a nice evening.